Is religion as a force in society a static, stagnant, conservative force, or is it a progressive, revolutionary, reformist force? This is a question that has been debated by academics for a very long time, and it is one that has invited a lot of discussion. To be transparent here, by progressive or revolutionary or reformist, I don't necessarily mean these terms in a purely Marxist or liberal or leftist sense. In relation to a society, the revolutionary aspect of a religion may be to overthrow or reform certain principles upon which that society is based, certain institutions, and replace them or reform them to that which is better, more moral or more ethical according to said religion. This doesn't necessarily mean that religions bring about a kind of utopia or some kind of either liberal or authoritarian dreamland. Rather, it's simply referring to the fact that do religions allow for a change to the society, or do they preserve the already established norms within said society? This question has been debated a lot by multiple academics. From the modernist camp, we have many Marxists, including Marx himself, who asserted that religion was the opium of the masses. Religion was the kind of spiritual drug which people took that gave them comfort, but it blinded them from the reality of their exploitation and oppression in society. Althusser, a structuralist Marxist, followed suit and said that religion is an ideological state apparatus which indoctrinates people with the beliefs of the ruling class and thereby perpetuating and reproducing the society at hand. However, Engels opted for a more nuanced approach, and he asserted that religion has a dual character. Religion can oftentimes be a revolutionary force, and it can also be a conservative force. Religion can sometimes act against the establishment and can sometimes be pro-establishment. Religion is not a monolith, and it can have a variety of functions, and oftentimes it can be anti-government or against oppression, and at the same time it can be used to legitimate oppression and legitimate certain actions by the state. This brings us to a very important point here, that we should probably take a more historical perspective on this and adopt a more nuanced approach. That would be more wiser in this regard, because it's quite clear that religion can be a revolutionary force, even though in many cases it has been a conservative force. It has legitimated the ideas of the ruling class of a society. For example, if we look at a lot of the Abrahamic religions when they first began, they did have a distinctly reformist and, dare I say, somewhat revolutionary character to their teachings. If we look at the Jewish religion, we see the liberation of a whole people from the tyrannic rule of the Pharaoh, according to at least the biblical narrative, whether one agrees with it or not. One could say that that is the spirit upon which that faith was founded. We see the Bible and the New Testament and the Christian faith was similarly founded on these reformist notions and somewhat revolutionary in a sense, where in the Roman Empire at that time, it was a very ultra sort of warrior culture and a very cruel kind of way of living that was present in that time, where 1/3 of the people in the Roman society at the time were slaves. However, Jesus comes along and he asserts that if people love one another enough, they treat people with justice, with kindness, they treat the meek and the poor well, they take care of the weak and the vulnerable, then they could attain God's kingdom on earth. This was quite subversive within that society, within the Roman society at the time, not least because of the fact that Christianity was a monotheistic religion which excluded the pantheon, the polytheistic gods of the Romans at the time. And there was no way to reconcile that kind of monotheism, which asserted the universality and alone correctness of the Christian faith, with the polytheism of the Romans. That subjected the Christians to 300 so years of persecution. We also see within Islamic civilization within the founding of the Islamic faith, that it was very much attempting to reform many aspects of morality in which they felt that the pagan Arabs had gone astray in. Believe it or not, despite what may be viewed as the conservative norms of the Muslims, or of course the more sort of radical types of Muslims at least, initially Islam was without a doubt, within that historical context, a reformist project in a sense, or in certain aspects, that aimed to solve certain moral issues that had arisen within the pagan Arabs at the time. In a certain way, it was also very much a revolutionary and subversive force. That danger was felt by the pagan Arabs when they kicked out the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his followers out of his town. The Muslims, not only though did they go on to establish a new kind of Islamic land or Islamic country or Islamic emirate within the Arab lands, they went on to conquer the two superpowers of the time, the Sassanid Empire, which they completely annihilated, and the Roman Empire, the Byzantium Empire, which they conquered half of. And that led to a complete shift, a complete change within the fabric of those societies which they conquered. Of course, to be fair here, these religions did end up becoming conservative forces in a way. And it's very simple to note this trajectory historically. When these religions first sprang up, they began as revolutionary or reformist movements, yet gradually when they became the establishment, when they were adopted by the ruling class, when they were used to form empires and political systems, they without a doubt adopted or had a certain conservative flavour to them. Hence, we often see this notion of the clerics being in line, or the priests being in line with the ruling class to help legitimate their rule. Although this is generally true, and religion and religious scholars have used their position to legitimate the state, it's important to note that there have always been dissidents, and it's not been a unanimous agreement of siding with the state. For example, we see how certain scholars within the early Islamic tradition, many of them being the greatest scholars considered by all Muslims to be the leaders of various schools of thought, they were often persecuted by the state. One famous example of this, of course, is the Inquisition of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And to be fair here, although the Mu'tazila creed, the beliefs of one of the sects of the early Sunni Islamic tradition, was used to legitimate state persecution, the opposition to that was also based in religious ideas, based in another sect of the early Sunni Islamic tradition. And it was precisely this opposing school of thought that went on to dominate a lot of the ruling class of the Abbasid Empire after this Inquisition for a few hundred years, which demonstrates that religion has an important role to play in legitimating state ideology and state sort of actions, and whether they be oppressive or not. But it also has an important counter role in that it can help oppose state oppression and oppose the dominant state ideology which may be enforced by that state. Thus, we can quite decisively conclude that although religion has been used as a conservative force to legitimate state ideology and state actions and legitimate the power of the ruling class, it can also at times be a revolutionary force and can help change the structure of the society and reform certain aspects of the society. Other examples of this kind of possibility of it being a revolutionary force may be liberation theology in South America, as mentioned by Maduro, or the civil rights movement, as mentioned by sociologist Bruce. The civil rights movement, of course, was famously headed by Martin Luther King, who was a Baptist pastor, and many of the leaders of the civil rights movement were very religious people, whether they be Christians or Muslims, such as Malcolm X. So, religion in society has a very nuanced role, and it's important, at least from a historical and sociological perspective, to take a more nuanced approach. Otherwise, we'll fall into very naive, simplistic, yet quite inaccurate views of the role of religion in society.